This is our road now, Mr. Henderson. The Heritage Bluffs Community Wellness and Safety Committee has determined that your excessive speed poses a threat to our residents, and we have taken appropriate measures. You'll find the invoice for the traffic calming installation in your mailbox. It's past due. The woman's voice, a syrupy blend of condescension and absolute authority, hung in the humid afternoon air. I stared at her, then at the three monstrous black and yellow speed bumps bolted directly into the asphalt of my private driveway, a half-mile-long stretch of road that was mine and mine alone. Karen, the president of the adjacent Homeowners Association, stood with her hands on her ample hips, a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield of righteousness. Her floral muumuu billowed slightly in the breeze, a garish flag planted on conquered territory. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of it left me speechless for a solid 10 seconds. I had spent 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, designing and building infrastructure in places where a single misplaced bolt could have catastrophic consequences. And this woman had just unilaterally declared my private property a public thoroughfare and vandalized it with cheap pre-fab traffic control devices. The raw, primal anger that flashed through me was hot enough to melt steel. But years of discipline kicked in, icing it over with a cold, clear resolve. This was a declaration of war. She just didn't know who she was fighting yet. If you've ever had a run-in with a power-mad HOA board member who thinks their three-ring binder of bylaws supersedes the U.S. Constitution, then you know the kind of battle I was facing. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and while you're at it, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and share your own HOA nightmare story. You're not alone, and trust me, you're going to want to see how this one ends. Now back to how it all started. 5 years ago, my wife Sarah and I bought our dream property. It was 20 acres of rolling hills and oak trees, a perfect slice of quiet country life bordering a national forest. The key feature, the one that made it all work, was the long, paved access road that cut through the property from the main county highway to the spot where we built our house. That road, every square inch of it, was part of our parcel, explicitly detailed in the deed and survey maps filed with the county clerk. Next to our 20 acres was the Heritage Bluffs subdivision, a sprawling development of cookie-cutter homes governed by one of the most notoriously militant HOAs in the state. We weren't part of it, had no desire to be, and the property line was clearly marked by a split rail fence I had maintained myself. The problem was that my private road offered a convenient shortcut for the residents of Heritage Bluffs to get to the highway, shaving about 3 minutes off their drive. For years, it was an unspoken agreement. A few cars would use it. They'd drive slowly, give a friendly wave. I didn't mind. I believed in being a good neighbor, but that was before Karen was elected HOA president on a platform of security, conformity, and appreciating property values. Her first act was to send a letter to everyone in Heritage Bluffs, officially sanctioning the use of my road as a community access easement, a legal term she had apparently learned from a daytime television judge. I had politely informed her, in writing, that no such easement existed and that the road was private property. Her response was silence, until today. Today, she hadn't just used the road, she had altered it, claimed it, and billed me for the privilege. She had crossed a line etched not just in dirt and fences, but in the bedrock of property law. As she stood there, smug and immovable, I could see the entire campaign unfolding in my mind. The letters, the lawyers, the leverage. She thought she was dealing with just another homeowner she could bully into submission with paperwork and fines. She was about to find out she had picked a fight with a man who understood topography, leverage, and the methodical deconstruction of enemy fortifications better than she could possibly imagine. The war had begun, and her cheap plastic speed bumps were her first and last strategic mistake. I let Karen's words hang in the air for another moment, allowing the full weight of her delusion to settle. I took a slow, deliberate breath, my eyes scanning from the first ugly speed bump near the county road to the second one halfway up my drive, and the third one right before the turnoff to my garage. They were bolted down with thick, ugly lag screws, the asphalt around them already showing signs of cracking from the installation. The damage was done, a physical scar representing her trespass. "Karen," I began, my voice dangerously calm, a tone I had once used to address a subordinate who had nearly gotten a whole platoon blown up. There are a few things you seem to misunderstand. First, this road is not, nor has it ever been, part of Heritage Bluffs. It is my private property, as clearly defined in the county records, which I'm sure you've never bothered to check. Second, your Wellness and Safety Committee has no jurisdiction here. Zero. Its authority ends at that fence line. I pointed a rigid finger toward the split-rail fence separating my land from her beige kingdom. Third, I continued, taking a step toward her, causing her to instinctively take a half step back, her clipboard rising a little higher. You and your contractors have trespassed, vandalized my property, and created an illegal obstruction. This isn't a traffic calming installation, it's criminal damage. Her face, which had been a mask of smug satisfaction, began to curdle. The condescending smile tightened into a grimace. Now I'm going to be very clear, she huffed, puffing out her chest. We have bylaws that allow us to ensure the safety of our residents from adjacent threats. Your constant speeding? I drive a 10-year-old pickup truck, Karen. I rarely go over 15 miles per hour on my own driveway. I cut in, my voice slicing through her rehearsed speech. This isn't about safety. This is about control. You want to control this road because it offers your residents a convenience, and you've manufactured a crisis to justify seizing it. I pulled out my phone and took a series of wide-angle photos, capturing her, the speed bumps, and my house in the background. Then I walked to each speed bump, taking detailed close-ups of the bolts, the cracks in the asphalt, and the cheap plastic. Her face was turning a shade of magenta that clashed horribly with her muumuu. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded. "I'm documenting your crime," I said simply, without looking up from my phone. "You have 48 hours to have these removed and to provide me with a written proposal for repairing the damage your contractors caused. If they are not gone by noon on Wednesday, I will have them removed myself, and you and the Heritage Bluffs HOA will be held financially and legally responsible for all associated costs. That includes my labor, equipment rental, and the complete repaving of the damaged sections." I finally looked up and met her gaze. The cold fury in my eyes must have finally penetrated her bubble of entitlement, because for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, but it was quickly replaced by indignant rage. "You can't threaten me," she shrieked. "I am the president of this association. We have a lawyer. We will bury you in paperwork. You'll be hearing from our legal counsel." She turned on her heel and stomped back toward the fence line, her clipboard held like a weapon she had forgotten how to use. I watched her go, a 5'5" Napoleon in polyester, retreating from a battle she thought she had already won. I knew her threat wasn't idle. She would lawyer up. She would send letters filled with legalese and baseless accusations. She would try to drown me in bureaucracy. It was the classic HOA shock and awe tactic. But I had spent a career navigating complex regulations and dealing with hostile forces. Paperwork didn't scare me, and unlike her, I had something she didn't: the truth, and the law was on my side. I walked into my house where Sarah was waiting, her face etched with worry. "I saw her out there," she said. "What did that horrible woman do?" I just held up my phone and showed her the pictures. Her eyes widened. "She can't do that, can she?" "She just did," I replied, my voice grim, "but she's going to regret it." That evening, I didn't just stew in anger. I channeled it. I went to my office and pulled out my property file. The original deed, the certified survey map with the surveyor's seal, the title insurance policy. I scanned every single one into a high-resolution PDF. I then went to the county assessor's online portal and downloaded the official plat map, which clearly showed Parcel A, mine, and the adjacent Heritage Bluff subdivision, hers, with the road falling entirely within my property lines. I compiled everything into a single, organized digital folder. This was my ammunition. Wednesday at noon was the deadline. The clock was ticking. Predictably, Wednesday morning arrived with no sign of a removal crew. Instead, the mail carrier delivered a crisp, cream-colored envelope bearing the Heritage Bluffs HOA logo. Inside was a 2-page letter, signed by Karen, printed on heavy bond paper that was probably more expensive than the speed bumps themselves. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic arrogance. The letter stated that, pursuant to bylaw 17 Section 4, Community Environmental Safety, The HOA was empowered to mitigate any external hazards impacting the neighborhood. It claimed that numerous documented complaints from residents about my reckless driving constituted such a hazard. It went on to inform me that my 48-hour ultimatum was rejected, and that if I attempted to tamper with or remove HOA safety equipment, I would be subject to a $500 fine per day and all associated legal fees. The letter finished by restating that the invoice for the installation, now with a late fee appended, was due immediately. I read the letter twice, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. It was perfect. It was a signed confession of her intent and her justification. The mention of a specific bylaw was a gift. I went to the Heritage Bluffs HOA website, which, in a fit of transparent governance, had all its governing documents posted as PDFs. I downloaded the full book of bylaws, a 100-plus page document of dense legalese and petty rules about lawn maintenance and trash can placement. I searched for Bylaw 17. It existed. It was about regulations for holiday decorations. Section 4 detailed the acceptable wattage for Christmas lights. There was no mention of community environmental safety, external hazards, or anything remotely related to traffic control on property the HOA didn't even own. She had invented it. She had put it in writing and signed her name to a complete fabrication. This wasn't just overreach anymore. This was fraud. I printed her letter, then printed the actual page from the bylaws. I highlighted the relevant sections on both documents. The case against her was building itself. At 11:59 a.m. on Wednesday, I took one last look down my driveway. The speed bumps were still there, like ugly monuments to her hubris. At 12:01 p.m., I made a phone call. Johnson Equipment Rental? Yes, I'd like to reserve a Bobcat S70 skid steer loader for tomorrow morning, and I'll need a bucket attachment and a pallet fork. And delivery to this address, please. The next morning, a flatbed truck rumbled up the county road and carefully backed onto the entrance of my driveway, stopping just short of the first speed bump. The driver unloaded the skid steer, a compact but powerful piece of machinery that I knew my way around from my years in the service. I signed the paperwork, hopped into the cab, and fired up the diesel engine. The machine roared to life, a satisfying growl of purpose. My plan was simple and methodical. I wasn't just going to rip them out. I was going to surgically remove them, documenting every step of the way. I set up a tripod with my phone to record a time-lapse of the entire operation. First, I used the pallet forks, carefully sliding them under the edges of the first speed bump. These things were just bolted on top of the asphalt. With a gentle lift and a slight curl of the forks, the cheap plastic groaned, and the lag bolts, which had been drilled directly into my driveway, began to pull free. The sound of asphalt chunks tearing away with the bolts was infuriating, but I kept my movements precise. I lifted the entire speed bump, a 30-pound piece of junk, and carefully placed it onto a wooden pallet I had set aside. I repeated the process for the other two. It took less than 15 minutes. The next phase was cleanup. I swapped the forks for the bucket attachment. The bolts had left behind a series of ugly, jagged holes, surrounded by fractured asphalt. I used the edge of the bucket to scrape up all the loose gravel and debris, collecting it into a neat pile. Then I took a push broom and swept the entire area clean, leaving nothing but the scarred surface of the road. The evidence of the damage was now stark and undeniable. There were 24 holes, each about 4 inches deep, surrounded by spiderwebs of cracks. The structural integrity of my driveway in those 3 spots was compromised. I took dozens of high-resolution photos of the damage from every angle. I photographed the removed speed bumps sitting on the pallet. I even photographed the pile of asphalt debris I had swept up. This wasn't just cleanup, it was evidence collection. The final step was the invoice. I drove the skid steer back to the front of my property to await pickup. I went inside to my office and drafted a new document. It was a formal invoice addressed to the Heritage Bluffs HOA, attention Karen. It had line items: labor for removal of illegal obstructions, 3 hours at my professional consulting rate of $150 per hour. Equipment rental, Bobcat S70 skid steer loader, 1-day rate, delivery and pickup fee. And the final beautiful line item: damages to private property, see attached estimate for asphalt repair. I attached a preliminary quote from a reputable paving company for milling and resurfacing the 3 damaged sections, which came to just over $4,000. The grand total of the invoice was $4,875.50. I printed the invoice, the rental agreement for the Bobcat, and the paving estimate. I packaged it all in a large envelope along with a letter. The letter was short and to the point. It stated that, as per my previous warning, the obstructions had been removed. It detailed the damage caused and enclosed the bill for all costs incurred. It also included a final sentence. The removed materials are available for you to retrieve from my property. They are currently stored on a pallet near the entrance to my driveway. If they are not collected within 7 days, a storage fee of $50 per day will be applied. I drove to the Heritage Bluffs Community Clubhouse and slid the envelope through the mail slot in the front door. The feeling was one of profound, cold satisfaction. The ball was back in her court. I had no doubt her next move would be irrational, emotional, and ultimately self-destructive. I was counting on it. The explosion came sooner than I expected. It wasn't a letter this time. It was the flashing blue and red lights of a sheriff's patrol car filling my rearview mirror as I returned from a supply run on Friday afternoon. The cruiser was parked sideways at the entrance to my driveway, blocking it completely. Karen was there, standing next to the deputy, pointing animatedly at my house, her face a mask of theatrical distress. As I pulled over and got out of my truck, I could hear her shrill voice carrying on the wind. Complete destruction of community property. He used a giant tractor, deputy. He's unhinged. I'm afraid for my safety and the safety of our residents. The deputy, a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, held up a hand to quiet her and turned to face me. He had a weary look in his eyes that told me this wasn't his first encounter with a dramatic HOA dispute. "Sir, are you Mr. Henderson?" he asked, his hand resting professionally on his duty belt. "I am," I said calmly. "Ma'am here claims you destroyed her property." He gestured vaguely toward the empty space where the speed bumps used to be. Karen chimed in. "Our speed bumps, they were worth over $1,000, and he tore them out of the ground. It's vandalism. I want to press charges." I ignored her and spoke directly to the deputy. "Deputy, that woman," I said, nodding toward Karen, "is the president of the neighboring HOA. A few days ago, she trespassed onto my private property and had those speed bumps installed on my private road without my consent. I have the deed, the survey map, and the county plat map in my house right now that will prove unequivocally that this road is mine." I gave her a written warning to remove them. She refused, so I removed them myself. There was no destruction of community property because it was never their property to begin with. What she's not telling you is that she's the one who committed a crime, trespass and destruction of my property. The deputy's expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He was a professional, and he knew the difference between a hysterical accusation and a calm statement of fact. "And he's threatening me," Karen shrieked. "He sent me a bill for thousands of dollars. It's extortion." "I sent her an invoice for the damages she caused," I corrected, still looking at the deputy. "I'd be happy to show you all the documentation. The letter she sent me, the bylaws she fabricated to justify her actions, the photos of the damage, the rental agreement for the equipment, everything." The deputy turned to Karen. "Ma'am, do you have any documentation showing that this road is the property of the HOA? Karen sputtered, her face flushing. "Well, it's a community access road. It's been used by our residents for years. It's understood." "So you don't have a deed or an easement filed with the county?" the deputy pressed. "We have bylaws," she insisted, waving her hands vaguely. "The bylaw gives us the right." "I have a copy of that bylaw, deputy," I interjected. "It's about Christmas lights. She made the whole thing up." That was the moment the deputy's patience visibly snapped. He let out a long, tired sigh. "Ma'am, this is a civil matter. It's a property dispute. It is not a criminal issue. I can't arrest a man for removing something from his own property." Karen's jaw dropped. But the vandalism, it's not vandalism if it's his property, ma'am. You need to talk to a lawyer. We're done here." He turned to me. "Sir, I'd advise you to do the same. Get a lawyer. It sounds like this is going to get messy." He gave me a short nod, got back in his cruiser, and drove away, leaving Karen standing alone in a cloud of dust and impotent rage. The public humiliation was exquisite. She had called in the cavalry, expecting them to haul me away in handcuffs, and instead, they had told her she was in the wrong. She stared at me, her eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. Then, without another word, she spun around and stormed back toward her subdivision. I knew this was far from over. This defeat would only make her more determined to destroy me. Sure enough, 2 days later, another cream-colored envelope arrived. This one was thicker. Inside was a formal notice from the Heritage Bluffs HOA. It was a fine, a massive one. The notice, again signed by Karen, informed me that I was being fined $500 for the unauthorized removal of HOA property and an additional $5,000 for willful destruction of community assets. But that wasn't the best part. The letter continued, stating that because I had used heavy machinery in a manner that was intimidating and threatening to the community, I was also being designated a nuisance resident under Bylaw 22. I didn't even bother looking that one up, and was being fined an additional $100 per day until the nuisance, which I presumed was my continued existence, was abated. The total due in 30 days was $5,500, plus the accruing daily fines. It was insane. It was a declaration of total war, fought with fabricated rules and imaginary authority. She was trying to bury me under a mountain of paper debt, but as I held the letter, I didn't feel anger. I felt a sense of grim clarity. She had given me more ammunition. The false police report, a form of harassment, the fraudulent fines, a clear case for a lawsuit. She was building my case for me, one unhinged letter at a time. This was no longer just about a few speed bumps. This was about dismantling a petty dictatorship. The deputy was right. It was time to get a lawyer. But I wasn't just going to play defense. I was going on the offensive. It was time to find out who else in Heritage Bluffs had been on the receiving end of Karen's tyrannical rule. I had a feeling I wasn't the only one. My first move wasn't to a lawyer's office, but to the neighborhood itself. On a quiet Saturday morning, I took a slow walk along the public sidewalk that bordered my property, the one that ran along the front of the first row of homes in Heritage Bluffs. I wasn't looking for trouble. I was looking for clues. I observed the houses, the lawns, the little details that the HOA bylaws likely governed with an iron fist. Most homes were identical, beige stucco with perfectly manicured lawns. But here and there, I saw tiny signs of rebellion. A slightly too tall sunflower peeking over a fence, a welcome mat that was a bit too whimsical, a basketball hoop that was probably only allowed on certain days of the week. Near the end of the block, I saw an older man, probably in his late 70s, meticulously tending to a small rose garden. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who had been caring for these plants for a very long time. His house was immaculate, but there was a quiet dignity to it that set it apart from the others. I walked over. "Morning," I said. "Those are some beautiful roses." He looked up, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. He had the kind of weathered, friendly face that immediately puts you at ease. "Thank you," he said, his voice a gentle rasp. "Been working on this particular breed for 20 years. Name's George." "Jack Henderson," I said, extending a hand. "I'm your neighbor, the one with the long driveway." George's smile widened. "Ah, yes, the man who removed the traffic calming devices. It's the talk of the neighborhood. I've been here 30 years, son. Seen a lot of things. But that was a first." He chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "I take it you've had a run-in with our esteemed President Karen." "You could say that," I said with a wry grin. "She's trying to find me into oblivion." George nodded slowly, snipping a dead leaf from a rose bush. "That's her way. Fines, threats, letters. She feeds on it. Most people just pay up. They don't want the trouble. They're afraid of her." He paused, looking me straight in the eye. "You don't seem afraid." "I'm not," I said. "I'm angry. And I'm starting to think I'm not the only one she's targeted." George let out another dry chuckle. "Son, you have no idea." He gestured toward his front door. "Come on in. I'll make some coffee. I've got some things you might want to see." I followed him into his house, which was filled with the comfortable clutter of a long life lived. Bookshelves overflowed, and photos of children and grandchildren covered the mantelpiece. He led me to a small study in the back, where a large desk was piled high with papers. But it was what was in the corner that caught my eye. 4 large, neatly labeled file boxes. The labels read HOA Correspondence 1990 to 2000, HOA Correspondence 2001 to 2010, and so on. George saw me looking. I was the association's secretary for a while, he explained. A long time ago, before Karen took over. I believe in keeping records. He pulled out the most recent box and set it on the desk. Karen's been president for 12 years now. She consolidated power by making herself the head of every important committee. Architectural review, finance, safety. She is the HOA, and she rules it like her own personal kingdom. For the next 2 hours, George walked me through a history of petty tyranny that was breathtaking in its scope. He showed me letters fining a young family $50 a day because their toddler's plastic slide was the wrong shade of green. He showed me a demand sent to a recent widow, ordering her to remove a small memorial bench she had placed under a tree in her front yard, a bench dedicated to her late husband. He showed me complaint after complaint filed by residents about Karen's abrasive behavior, all of them marked reviewed and dismissed by the grievance committee, which, of course, Karen herself chaired. But the real bombshell was in the financial records. George, as a former board member, still had access to the annual budgets. He pulled out the last 5 years' worth. Look here, he said, pointing to a line item that appeared every year. Community consulting services. The amount was never less than $20,000 a year. I asked about this at a meeting once, George said. Karen said it was for legal and environmental consulting to protect our community standards. She was very vague, shut down any further questions, said it was privileged information. My mind started turning. Consulting services? To who? There should be a record of payments, invoices from the consulting firm. There should be, George said, his eyes glinting. But there aren't, at least not in the report she shares with the homeowners. It's just a lump sum, no details. George, I asked, do you know Karen's maiden name? He thought for a moment. It was Kowalski, I think. Why? I pulled out my phone and did a quick search of the state's business registry. I searched for consulting firms established in the last 12 years with the name Kowalski. Nothing. Then I tried a variation. I searched for her husband's name. Nothing. Then I had an idea. I searched for her son's name, who I remembered seeing on a graduate spotlight in an old HOA newsletter George had shown me. Bingo. A company called K Strategies, LLC was registered 8 years ago. The registered agent and sole officer was Karen's son. The address listed was his apartment. I then did another search, this time for Environmental Solutions Group, Inc., registered 6 years ago. The sole officer? Karen's sister-in-law. My God, George whispered, looking over my shoulder at the phone screen. She's paying her own family. She's not just paying them, I said, the cold, hard pieces clicking into place. She's embezzling. She's created shell companies, awarded them no-bid consulting contracts, and has been funneling HOA dues directly into her family's pockets for years. The speed bumps weren't just about control. They were about creating a problem that required a solution that would eventually involve one of her family's fake companies to consult on traffic safety, generating another invoice and another payday. It was a racket, and I had just stumbled right into the middle of it. This was no longer a civil dispute. This was a criminal conspiracy. George and I looked at each other. The fight had just gotten a whole lot bigger and a whole lot more dangerous. Armed with the explosive revelation of Karen's financial dealings, George and I knew our next step was to build a coalition. A single angry homeowner, even one with the law on his side, could be dismissed as a troublemaker. But a group of organized, informed residents demanding answers? That was a force Karen couldn't easily ignore. George, with his decades of history in the neighborhood, became our strategist. He knew everyone, their grievances, their personalities, and most importantly, who could be trusted. We need to be careful, he advised as we sat in his study, a list of potential allies taking shape on a legal pad. Karen has her loyalists, people who like the rigid order she imposes, or people who are simply too afraid to cross her. We need the ones who have been wronged but have been too isolated to fight back. Our first visit was to the Miller family, the young couple who had been fined for their child's green plastic slide. We found them in their backyard, a scene of domestic tranquility that was under constant threat from Karen's arbitrary rule. The infamous slide was gone, replaced by a drab HOA-approved wooden swing set. When we explained what we had found, Mr. Miller's face hardened. "She made my wife cry," he said, his voice low. "Sent us 3 letters in a week, threatening a lien on our house over a piece of plastic. We just gave up. It wasn't worth the fight." "We think it is," I said, laying out a copy of the K Strategies LLC business filing on their patio table. "This isn't just about a slide. It's about her using your money to enrich her family while she bullies you into submission." He stared at the document, then at his wife. A silent communication passed between them. "What do you need us to do?" he asked. Next was Mrs. Davis, the widow who had been forced to remove the memorial bench for her husband. She was a gentle, soft-spoken woman, and the memory of Karen's cruelty was still a fresh wound. When George explained the situation, she began to weep softly. "That bench was all I had left of him in the garden," she whispered. She called it unauthorized landscape clutter in her letter. Harold loved that garden. I felt a surge of protective anger. This was the human cost of Karen's reign. It wasn't just about money or rules. It was about a profound lack of decency and compassion. "Mrs. Davis," I said gently, "we're going to hold her accountable for this. For everything. All we need is your support. Your story is powerful." She wiped her eyes and nodded, a new firmness in her gaze. "For Harold," she said. "Yes, I'll help." We spent the rest of the week in quiet, discreet conversations. We met in living rooms, on back patios, and over coffee. Each meeting followed the same pattern. Initial fear and reluctance gave way to anger as we shared the evidence, which grew with every story we heard. There was the family fine for having their garage door open for more than an hour. The retired couple ordered to repaint their front door because the shade of blue had been discontinued from the approved palette. The man who got a violation notice because his pickup truck, which he needed for his contracting business, was deemed a commercial vehicle and couldn't be parked in his own driveway overnight. Each person had a story, a file of threatening letters, a memory of public humiliation at an HOA meeting. They were all threads in the same tapestry of abuse. After a week, we had a core group of 12 families, a silent majority that was no longer willing to be silent. I used my military planning skills to organize our next steps. We weren't a mob. We were a disciplined unit. We scheduled a secret meeting at a community hall several towns over, a neutral location where we wouldn't be seen. On the night of the meeting, the room was thick with a mixture of anxiety and determination. I stood at the front of the room, not as a commander, but as a fellow victim. I didn't give a speech. I presented a case. On a projector screen, I displayed the chain of evidence. My deed and survey map, Karen's fraudulent letters to me, the actual bylaw about Christmas lights, the invoice for the skid steer, the photos of the damage, the bogus fines she had levied against me. Then I moved to the larger conspiracy. I showed them the HOA's budget, the line item for consulting, and the state business filings for the LLCs belonging to Karen's son and sister-in-law. I created a flowchart that showed the money moving from their HOA dues into the HOA's general fund, and then out to Karen's family under the guise of fake consulting fees. A gasp went through the room. Seeing it all laid out, clear and undeniable, was a powerful moment. The isolated incidents they had all suffered were suddenly part of a larger, more sinister pattern. "She's not just a bully," Mr. Miller said, his voice shaking with rage. "She's a crook." "Exactly," I said, "and we're going to expose her. But we have to be smart. We need to be strategic." That's when I introduced them to the final piece of my plan. Her name was Jessica Albright, a sharp, tenacious lawyer who specialized in HOA and property law. I had already had a preliminary consultation with her. She was, to put it mildly, thrilled. She saw the case not just as a property dispute, but as a potential class action suit against a fraudulent board. "Ms. Albright is ready to represent us," I told the group. "She's going to draft the legal documents. a cease and desist order for the harassment against me, a formal demand for a full forensic audit of the HOA's finances, backed by our evidence, and a lawsuit, a big one, for trespass, property damage, harassment, and for the fraudulent fines levied against all of you. We will demand not only that the fines be rescinded, but that you be compensated for the emotional distress. The room was silent for a moment, and then it erupted. Not in angry shouts, but in applause. It was the sound of hope. The sound of people who had been powerless for years finally seeing a path to justice. Our alliance was forged. We had the evidence, we had the numbers, and now we had the legal firepower. The next phase of the war was about to begin, and it would be fought on her turf, in the realm of paperwork, bylaws, and legal motions. Only this time, we were the ones with the bigger guns. Jessica Albright was exactly the kind of lawyer you want on your side in a fight like this. She was in her late 30s with a razor-sharp mind and a palpable disdain for bullies. When I laid out the file George and I had compiled, her eyes lit up with a predatory gleam. "This is a gift," she said, tapping the printout of the Case Strategies, LLC filing. "It's one thing to prove overreach and harassment. That's common. But to have clear evidence of self-dealing and potential embezzlement, that's the kill shot. We're not just going to win, we're going to dismantle her entire operation." Our strategy was a three-pronged legal assault designed to overwhelm Karen and the HOA board before they even knew what hit them. The first prong was personal. Jessica drafted a brutal cease and desist letter addressed directly to Karen. It detailed her actions against me, from the illegal installation of the speed bumps to the fraudulent fines and the false police report. It demanded she immediately cease all contact and retract the fines, warning that any further communication would be considered evidence of continued harassment. It also formally put her on notice that a lawsuit for damages was imminent. This was designed to isolate her and put her on the defensive legally. The second prong was aimed at the HOA as an entity. Jessica prepared a formal, legally binding demand for a full forensic audit of the association's books, going back 10 years. Under state law, a certain percentage of homeowners could petition for such an audit. With our new alliance, we had more than enough signatures. The demand letter cited specific irregularities, namely the large unexplained payments to consulting firms, and attached the business records for the companies owned by Karen's relatives. This wasn't just a request, it was an accusation, and it legally obligated the board to respond. Refusal to comply would open them up to immediate court action. The third and final prong was the lawsuit itself. It was a masterpiece of legal aggression. I was the lead plaintiff, but it was structured to be easily joined by other residents. The suit named Karen personally, as well as the Heritage Bluffs HOA Board of Directors, as defendants. The charges were numerous: trespass, destruction of property, slander for the false police report, breach of fiduciary duty, and civil conspiracy. We asked for compensatory damages to cover the road repair and my legal fees, but we also asked for significant punitive damages to punish their malicious conduct. Jessica timed the delivery perfectly. On a Monday morning, a process server, a big, imposing man who looked like a former linebacker, hand-delivered the first package to Karen at her home. It contained the cease and desist letter and the demand for the audit, signed by a dozen of her neighbors. We had a spotter, Mr. Miller, who watched from his window. He reported that Karen took the package, slammed the door, and a few minutes later, he could hear her shouting inside. An hour later, the same process server walked into the office of the management company that handled the HOA's day-to-day affairs and served the lawsuit. The trap was now set. We knew Karen's arrogance would be her undoing. A sensible person, upon receiving such a comprehensive legal threat, would immediately contact their lawyer, hunker down, and try to negotiate. But Karen wasn't sensible. She was a narcissist, and her ego wouldn't allow her to admit defeat or even weakness. Her response came 3 days later, and it was even more foolish than we had hoped. It was a letter from the HOA's lawyer, a man who was clearly just a rubber stamp for Karen's whims. The letter was dismissive and contemptuous. It characterized my claims as frivolous and vexatious. It stated that the board had full confidence in President Karen's leadership and that all financial matters were in perfect order. It rejected the demand for an audit, calling it an unwarranted fishing expedition. And in a stunning act of self-sabotage, it threatened to countersue me and the other petitioners for defamation and causing distress to a community leader. Jessica cackled with glee when I forwarded her the letter. They're countersuing? For defamation? For stating facts that are a matter of public record? She said over the phone. Oh, this is beautiful. Her lawyer's either incompetent or he's just cashing her checks. They've just waived their right to settle this quietly. They've chosen to go to war in public, and they've officially refused a legal request for an audit, which gives us grounds to go to a judge and get a court order. The legal trap had snapped shut. By refusing the audit, Karen had given us the perfect excuse to escalate. Jessica immediately filed a motion with the county court to compel the HOA to submit to a forensic audit, attaching all our evidence of self-dealing. A hearing was set. Karen thought her lawyer's letter was a show of strength. In reality, it was a suicide note. She was so blinded by her own authority that she couldn't see that the legal framework she used to terrorize people was now being used to systematically dismantle her. While the lawyers handled the court filings, our community alliance focused on the next major battleground, the upcoming annual HOA meeting. It was scheduled in 3 weeks. For years, this meeting had been a carefully orchestrated piece of theater, with Karen controlling the agenda and shouting down any dissent. This year would be different. We had the numbers, we had the evidence, and we were preparing for a public showdown that would strip her of her power once and for all. We began a quiet campaign, going door to door, sharing our story and the evidence with every resident who would listen. We weren't just fighting a lawsuit anymore. We were organizing a revolution. The 3 weeks leading up to the annual HOA meeting were a blur of strategic preparation. Our small alliance had grown. The news of the lawsuit and the court motion for an audit had spread like wildfire through Heritage Bluffs. People who had been afraid to speak up were now quietly seeking us out, offering their support and sharing their own stories of Karen's abuse. We were no longer a dozen families. We were closer to 50, representing a significant voting bloc in the community of about 200 homes. Our objective for the meeting was clear: to execute a vote of no confidence in Karen and the entire current board, and to elect a new interim board that would immediately comply with the audit and clean house. Under the HOA's own bylaws, the real ones, not the ones Karen invented, such a vote could be called from the floor if a quorum of homeowners was present and a majority supported the motion. We knew we had the numbers. The challenge was to execute it before Karen could shut the meeting down. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile, beige room that felt more like a courtroom than a neighborhood gathering place. Karen and her 2 cronies on the board, a timid-looking man named Frank and a woman who glared at everyone with suspicion, sat at a long table at the front, looking out at the assembled homeowners. The air was thick with tension. Usually these meetings were sparsely attended, with only 20 or 30 people showing up. Tonight the room was packed. Over 100 residents filled the chairs, and more stood along the back wall. Karen noticed the crowd, and a flicker of unease crossed her face, but it was quickly replaced by her usual imperious expression. She banged a gavel on the table. "Welcome to the Heritage Bluffs annual homeowners meeting," she began, her voice amplified by a small microphone. "We have a lot to get through tonight, so we will be strictly adhering to the published agenda. We will begin with the president's report." She launched into a self-congratulatory speech about all the accomplishments of the past year. The new petunias planted at the entrance, the successful negotiation of a new trash collection contract, and, I noted with grim satisfaction, the proactive implementation of traffic safety measures to protect our children. As she spoke, I sat in the front row with George on one side and Jessica Albright, my lawyer, on the other. Jessica was there purely as an observer, but her presence, with a leather briefcase resting by her feet, was a powerful psychological weapon. When Karen finished her speech, she said, "Now we'll move on to the financial report from our treasurer, Frank." Frank, the timid board member, began to nervously read from a spreadsheet, droning on about assets and expenditures in vague, unhelpful terms. When he got to the line item for community consulting, he mumbled the figure, $22,000, and tried to move on quickly. That was our moment. Mr. Miller, the man with the green slide, stood up from the middle of the room. "Point of order, Madam President," he called out, his voice clear and strong. Karen glared at him. You are out of order, Mr. Miller. Please sit down. There will be a question and answer period at the end of the meeting if we have time. I'm not asking a question, Mr. Miller retorted. According to Bylaw 3, Section 2, any member can raise a point of order regarding the accuracy of a report. I would like to know who the community consultants are that we paid $22,000 to last year. The room went quiet. Karen's face tightened. That information is confidential, pertaining to ongoing legal strategies to protect the community, she snapped. Now sit down or I will have you removed. This was the cue. I stood up. I think the community deserves to know, I said, my voice filling the room, because I happen to have the answer. All eyes turned to me. Karen's face went from angry to apoplectic. Mr. Henderson, you are not a member of this association. You have no right to speak here. You are trespassing. Actually, Jessica Albright said, standing up calmly beside me, Mr. Henderson is here as my guest. And as legal counsel for over 40 homeowners in this room, I can assure you his information is highly relevant. She gestured to me to continue. I turned to face the crowd. The $22,000 you paid in consulting fees last year didn't go to any law firm or environmental group, I announced. It went to a company called K Strategies, LLC, a company whose sole officer is Karen's own son. A wave of murmurs and gasps swept through the room. I wasn't finished. And the year before that, a similar amount went to a company called Environmental Solutions Group, Incorporated, owned by her sister-in-law. I had prepared for this. I pulled out a small, powerful projector from my bag and aimed it at the blank wall behind Karen's head. I clicked a button, and the state business filings for both companies, showing the names and addresses, appeared on the wall in giant, undeniable letters. The crowd erupted. Shouts of "Thief!" and "Resign!" echoed through the clubhouse. Karen was on her feet, banging the gavel frantically. "Order! Order! These are lies! This is a coordinated attack! This meeting is adjourned." But it was too late. George stood up, his voice steady and resonant despite his age. "Madam President, you cannot adjourn this meeting. I call for a vote of no confidence in you and the entire board of directors." "Seconded," yelled a dozen voices at once. Karen's face was a mottled mess of red and white. She looked trapped, her authority evaporating before her very eyes. "This is illegal. You can't do this," she screamed over the noise. "Actually, you can," Jessica said, her voice cutting through the din. Bylaw 4, Section 5. A vote of no confidence can be called from the floor by any member and seconded. It requires a simple majority vote of the members present. I count over 100 members here. You need 51 votes. The public showdown was happening. The trap I had so carefully set had been sprung not in a courtroom, but here in the heart of her own kingdom, in front of the very people she had terrorized for years. Her paper-thin authority, built on lies and intimidation, was being shredded in a storm of her own making. The revolution was televised, or at least projected onto a wall. The chaos in the clubhouse was a beautiful thing to behold. It was the sound of a dam breaking, of years of pent-up frustration and fear being released in a single, cathartic wave. Karen, completely losing her composure, continued to shriek about illegal procedures and personal attacks, but no one was listening to her anymore. The power in the room had shifted, palpably and irreversibly. George, acting with the quiet authority of an elder statesman, took control. "We will now proceed with the vote of no confidence in the current board president, Karen," he announced, his voice carrying over her protests. "All those in favor of removing Karen from the board of directors, please stand." It was like a wave. I stood, Jessica beside me. The Millers stood. Mrs. Davis, the widow, stood tall and proud. One by one, row by row, the people of Heritage Bluffs got to their feet. The man with the unapproved pickup truck. The couple with the wrong-colored front door. Families I had never even met, who had clearly suffered their own indignities, rose in solidarity. In less than a minute, more than 3/4 of the room was standing. It was a silent, powerful indictment. Karen stared out at the sea of standing figures, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. Her two board members, Frank and the other woman, looked at the floor, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. "All opposed?" George asked into the silence. No one stood, not even Frank. Karen stood alone. both figuratively and literally. "The motion carries," George declared. "Karen is hereby removed from the board of directors of the Heritage Bluffs HOA, effective immediately." A smattering of applause broke out, which quickly grew into a full-blown ovation. Karen looked as though she had been physically struck. She grabbed her gavel, her purse, and her binder of lies and stormed out of the room, shoving people out of her way as she went. She didn't say another word. She didn't have to. Her reign was over. The process was repeated for the other two board members, who were removed with similar overwhelming majorities. They scurried out of the room in Karen's wake, their complicity laid bare. With the old board gone, George then moved to elect an interim board to manage the association's affairs until a proper election could be held. He was nominated and elected unanimously as the interim president. Mr. Miller was elected treasurer, and Mrs. Davis was elected secretary. Their first act as the new board was to pass a motion, right then and there. "The interim board of the Heritage Bluffs HOA," George announced, "votes unanimously to comply fully with the court motion for a complete independent forensic audit of all financial records for the past 10 years. We will cooperate with all legal proceedings and work to uncover the full extent of any financial misconduct." Their second motion was to immediately freeze and retract all outstanding fines and violations issued by Karen's board in the last year, pending a full review. A cheer went through the room. People were hugging each other, shaking hands, a sense of collective liberation washing over them. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The forensic audit, which the new board happily paid for, was a bloodbath. It confirmed everything we suspected and uncovered even more. The auditors found over $150,000 in HOA funds had been paid to the two shell companies owned by Karen's son and sister-in-law over an 8-year period. The invoices were vague for services like environmental impact analysis and community safety protocol review, with no actual work product ever delivered. It was a clear-cut case of embezzlement. The audit also uncovered a slush fund Karen had maintained using HOA credit cards for personal expenses, lavish dinners, shopping sprees, even a weekend trip to a spa, which she had coded as board meeting expenses or office supplies. The new board, led by George, turned the entire audit report, along with all our collected evidence and witness statements, over to the district attorney's office. At first, the DA's office was hesitant, as white-collar crime in a homeowners association wasn't exactly their top priority. But Jessica Albright, relentless as ever, made it her personal mission. She called, she wrote letters. She presented the case so cleanly and professionally that they couldn't ignore it. The sheer volume of evidence and the number of victims were too compelling. About a month after the HOA meeting, I was at home, reviewing the final repair quote for my driveway, when I got a call from Mr. Miller. "You're not going to believe this," he said, his voice buzzing with excitement. "Turn on the local news." I flipped on the TV. And there it was. The camera showed the front of Karen's house, the same house from which she had ruled her little kingdom. Two uniformed police officers were leading her out the front door. Her hands were cuffed behind her back. She was trying to hide her face from the cameras, her floral muumuu now looking less like a symbol of power and more like a pathetic shroud. The reporter's voiceover explained that the former president of the Heritage Bluffs HOA had been arrested on multiple felony charges, including embezzlement, wire fraud, and grand larceny. As they put her in the back of the patrol car, she looked up for a moment, and her eyes met the camera. The smugness, the arrogance, the righteous indignation, it was all gone. All that was left was the shrunken, pathetic face of a common thief who had been caught. The collapse was total. Her cronies, the son and the sister-in-law, were also charged as co-conspirators. Faced with a mountain of evidence, they all eventually took plea deals, pleading guilty to lesser charges in exchange for their cooperation and paying back a portion of the stolen money. Karen, as the ringleader, received the harshest sentence: 2 years in state prison. It was a stunning, absolute victory. The bully hadn't just been beaten, she had been systematically and legally obliterated by the very people she had tried to crush. With Karen's criminal case resolved and a new responsible board in place at Heritage Bluffs, the only remaining piece of business was my civil lawsuit. The reformed HOA, now under George's sensible leadership, had no interest in fighting. Their new lawyer reached out to Jessica Albright almost immediately to discuss a settlement. The negotiations were short and amicable. The HOA agreed to pay for the full cost of repairing my driveway, which involved professionally milling the damaged sections and laying new, seamless asphalt. They agreed to cover all of my legal fees, which were substantial, and they agreed to pay for the cost of the skid steer rental and my documented labor for removing the speed bumps in the first place. The final part of the settlement was non-monetary, but in many ways, the most important. The HOA board issued a formal public letter of apology to me and my family, which was mailed to every single resident of Heritage Bluffs. It acknowledged that the previous board had acted illegally and unethically, that they had trespassed on my property, damaged it, and subjected me to baseless harassment. It was a complete and total vindication. A few weeks later, a check for just over $15,000 arrived in the mail. I held it in my hand, looking at the Heritage Bluffs logo in the corner. It wasn't just money. It was a symbol of justice delivered, of a battle fought and won not with brute force, but with patience, strategy, and the rule of law. The paving company came the following week. The sound of their heavy equipment, so different from the roar of the skid steer I had rented, was the sound of restoration. They worked for a full day, their crew professional and efficient. When they were done, my driveway was perfect. The scars were gone, replaced by a smooth, dark ribbon of fresh asphalt. There was no trace of Karen's ugly monuments to her own ego. The physical evidence of the conflict had been erased, but the lessons learned would remain. That weekend, Sarah and I walked the length of the driveway at sunset. The air was cool, and the sky was painted in shades of orange and purple. We looked out over our 20 acres of quiet, peaceful land. It was ours, uncontested, unobstructed. "You did it," she said softly, slipping her hand into mine. "You took on a tyrant, and you won." "We did it," I corrected her. "It started with us, but it ended with a community. George, the Millers, Mrs. Davis, all of them." It was true, my personal fight had become a catalyst for something much bigger. It had transformed a neighborhood ruled by fear into a community bound by a shared victory. I knew what I wanted to do with the money from the settlement. After the repairs and legal fees were paid, there was still a few $1,000s left over. The following Saturday, we threw a party. I used the remaining funds to rent a huge barbecue smoker, buy dozens of racks of ribs, and hire a local band. We sent out an invitation not just to the members of our alliance, but to every single home in Heritage Bluffs. We set up tables and chairs in my large front meadow, right next to the pristine, newly paved road. At first, people were hesitant, trickling in slowly, but soon the meadow was filled with families. Children ran and played where Karen had once stood and declared my land to be hers. Neighbors who had only ever exchanged curt nods were now laughing and sharing food. George was holding court by the smoker, telling stories. Mrs. Davis brought a bouquet of roses from her garden to give to Sarah. The Miller's kids played on a brand new, brightly colored slide we had set up for the occasion. It was more than just a party. It was a reclamation. It was a celebration of decency, of community, of the simple idea that people should be good to one another. As the sun went down and the band started playing a familiar tune, I looked at the crowd. I saw the faces of people who were no longer afraid. The cloud of petty tyranny had lifted, replaced by the warm glow of string lights and the sound of laughter. My private road, the source of the entire conflict, was now a symbol of connection. Cars were parked along it, not as a shortcut, but as a path to a gathering of friends. Justice, I realized, isn't just about punishing the wicked. It's about restoring what was broken. It's about taking the money a thief stole and using it to throw a feast for the entire village. It's about turning a battlefield into a dance floor. Standing there with my wife by my side, watching a community reborn, I felt a sense of peace that was deeper and more satisfying than any victory I had ever achieved on a real battlefield. The war was over, and we had all won.